Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever everyone may be. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first major conference, I think, co-organized between the Center for Comparative Public Law in Hong Kong and the Center for Asian Initiatives in Victoria, Canada. We are thrilled to have you today to discuss a tremendously important and contemporary topic, Belt and Road Initiatives in Africa. It will not be an understatement to call this project the project of the century. With the building of deep water ports, high-speed rail, fiber optic cables across Africa and Southeast Asia, we have seen the enhancement of maritime, ground, and digital connectivity across continents. It holds great promise, and there are, of course, some perils. The Trump administration had labeled Belt and Road a dead diplomacy, pointing to the alleged Chinese takeover of Mombasa port in Sri Lanka as Exhibit A. But in an insightful article by Professor Deborah Brodigham in the Atlantic Journal this month, she argued how this characterization is a myth, and we're delighted to have her here today to provide the keynote address. Others, like Jonathan Hillman in a book published last year by Yale University Press, views this project as an imperial one. It does not help that China now holds a 99-year lease over Mombasa port, the same length of time that the British colonial powers once secured over Hong Kong. This conference brings together scholars from all over the world to examine three specific issues pertaining to BRI in Africa: debt sustainability, transparency, and dispute resolution. We hope that every one of you would dip into the panels, attend as many as you like, ask as many questions as you like. We hope you learn from us as much as we will learn from you. Speaking of dispute resolution, I will just end my welcome address by mentioning one constitutional case decided by our highest court in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, on Sino-African investments. FG Hemisphere versus Democratic Republic of Congo. The case was decided in 2011 before Belt and Road was officially launched. But as we know, Sino-African investments had begun way before 2013, and the decision's impact on BRI was immense. On the facts, the plaintiff, FG Hemisphere, was trying to impede Congo and attach funds originating from China that was earmarked for a development scheme negotiated between China and Congo. The issue before the court was whether the doctrine of absolute immunity for state action would apply in Hong Kong. Mainland China applies absolute immunity for all cases. But Hong Kong, long-standing practice since its colonial days, was to apply a restrictive theory of state immunity, which had carved out an exception to state immunity for commercial transactions that states undertook. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs had placed 3 letters before the Hong Kong courts, twice in the lower courts and once before the final court appeal, insisting that the local judiciary must enforce absolute immunity for absolute theory of state immunity as practiced in the whole of China. As we all know, China has pledged billions of dollars in investments of loans and investments in Africa and Asia to boost its political influence in the region and on the international stage, even more so under Belt and Road. If absolute immunity in Hong Kong were rejected, many of China's state-owned and state-backed enterprises with significant resources in Hong Kong would have their assets earmarked for these loans and investments siphoned off by international voucher funds, of which FG Hemisphere, the plaintiff, was one. Therefore, this would have impeded China's foreign policy strategy abroad and impacting the future of Belt and Road. In the end, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal decided to make a judicial reference, its first and only in history, to Beijing for the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress to rule on the matter. Therefore, it is quite clear that Hong Kong was and remains an important gateway to this global project. And on this basis, I think I will just hand over the floor to Professor Victor Ramraj to say a few words. Victor?
Thanks very much, Po-Jen, and a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all, and a warm welcome to this joint CAPI-CCPL webinar on China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. My name is Victor Ramraj, and I'm the director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives, known as CAPI. And I'm coming to you today from Victoria, BC, on the west coast of Canada. And so let me take a moment, even though we're here virtually, let me take a moment, as we do here in Victoria, to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory our university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. In a moment, I will introduce and hand the floor over to my colleague, Marlia Clark, who will introduce our keynote speaker and chair the first session. But first, a few quick points. So first, let me say how delighted I am to be collaborating again with Professor Yap and his colleagues at the Center for Comparative Public Law at the University of Hong Kong. I've been very privileged to have visited the center many times, and this event marks an even stronger tie between our two institutions. If you haven't been to the Center for Comparative Public Law, I hope that when conditions allow that you'll be able to do so, and I recommend it strongly to you. Second, let me extend my warmest congratulations to Professors Ying Xia and Ngozi Nwoko for organizing this remarkable conference and for bringing the China-Africa relationship to our direct attention. Their framing of the conference around the three themes mentioned by Po-Jen: debt sustainability, transparency and good governance, and dispute resolution seem entirely eminent, make eminent sense to me. And I look forward very much to learning from this distinguished group of scholars and experts that they've assembled for this event. Finally, I'm fortunate to be able to work with a terrific group of colleagues at the University of Victoria, who, despite our distance from Africa and China, are keenly interested in the Asia-Africa relationship and the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean world. Among them, I'm proud to count the moderator of today's session, Professor Marlia Clark. Professor Marlia Clark is an associate professor of political science at the University of Victoria and a senior research fellow at CAPI, our Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives. She has lived in and worked extensively in Southern Africa, spending a significant amount of research time at the University of Cape Town, among others. Professor Clark's research has focused on African political economy and development, with a particular emphasis on post-colonial transitions to democracy, state and labor market restructuring, state civil society relations, and labor movements and community resistance in South Africa. I'll refrain from listing her many publications, but of particular interest for today's purposes is her work on global commodity chains and networks across the Indian Ocean from Asia to Africa. Professor Clark, may I turn the floor over to you now to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker. Thank you and welcome everyone.
Thank you very much, Victor, for the opening comments and the warm introduction to me and to the session overall. As Victor noted, I'm Marlia Clark. I'm in the Political Science Department here at the University of Victoria, and importantly, a research associate at CAPI. I am absolutely delighted today to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for the first session, who you'll get to hear in the keynote and then again in the panel discussion following the keynote. Dr. Deborah Brautenham is the Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of Political Economy and the Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. Her most recent books include The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China and Africa, 2010 publication, and Will Africa Feed China, 2015 publication. Before joining SAIS in 2012, Deborah taught at Columbia University and American University. Her teaching and research focuses on international development strategies, governance, and foreign aid, with a particular focus on Chinese aid and development finance to Africa. She has twice won the Fulbright Research Award and is a recipient of fellowships from the Council of Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and has held research grants from the UK Economic and Social Research Council and the UK Centre for Economic Policy and Research. She has an incredibly long and impressive bio and a very impressive list of research work, as well as consultancies. Rather than going through and outlining some of these important research projects and contributions, I would rather turn the time over to her so you will have the benefit of hearing her talk today. What I will do then is conclude by saying that I believe anyone who has been working on topics linked to China and Africa, Chinese aid and development finance, has probably come across her work or at least knows her name. I have read her work extensively and tried a few years ago to get her to come and visit us at the University of Victoria, but due to a sabbatical, she was unable to. So I'm absolutely delighted to have her here today and to have her as a keynote speaker to kick off what I know will be a terrific 3-day virtual conference. Deborah, let me please turn the floor over to you. Please, everyone, just join me virtually in welcoming Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. I feel very happy to be back in Hong Kong and also in Victoria. It's a delight, but particularly Hong Kong. In 1979, I was living in Hong Kong and immersed in intensive Mandarin classes. I'd been away from home for 2.5 years at that point. And in July that year, a song came out, Ganlan Shu. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called Olive Tree, and it captivated me by its haunting lyrics. 不要问我从哪里来，我的故乡在远方. Don't ask me where I come from. My homeland is far away. In that same year, 1979, the first Chinese construction companies, newly freed from Maoist controls, began to seek profitable business overseas. So I want to tell you today a little bit about those stories. Let me share my screen with you. There we go. And my talk is called Risk in Africa's Chinese Borrowing. So here we have on the left-hand side, Sam Mao, who was the person who wrote the lyrics for Ganlan Shu. And on the right-hand side is a picture of me in 1979, actually it was 1980, on the Yangtze River in China. And so in that year, 1979, when the first Chinese construction companies were going overseas, they reported signing 27 construction contracts worth a combined total of $33 million. And 40 years later, in 2019, Chinese engineering firms reported signing nearly 12,000 contracts overseas with a combined total of $260 billion. So for 40 years, Chinese loan finance has been boosting the overseas business of Chinese firms. And for almost that long, I've been watching this unfold. In 1983, 3 years after I first heard Ganlan Shu, I was myself in West Africa, where San Mao had been living when she wrote that song. studying Chinese aid and interviewing Chinese officials wherever I can find them. And there's one right here. So today, observers of China's global infrastructure business ambitions tend to fall into one of three camps. The first sees an increasingly dangerous China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, with a strategic plan to entrap whole regions of the developing world by using debt to leverage economic and political concessions. This group is dismissive of the notion that borrowers from China have independent agency, that they are more than victims. And in this group, we just, there is only malign China. So we can call that group malign China. And then there's the second group that sees Chinese engagement overseas as pretty much win-win. Chinese debt can easily be restructured, rescheduled, or refinanced, a Zambian economist told a reporter. Forbes magazine wrote that China is basically a free money machine because of all of its debt write-offs. And the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs routinely repeats China never presses borrowers for repayment. So this is a paradigm of benign China. And finally, there's a third group, which is small but growing. And this group asks, what do we actually see when we soak and poke in the best evidence we can gather? When we spend, as Hong Kong University's Professor C.K. Lee did, years going back and forth to Zambia to paint a portrait of Chinese capital that is simultaneously patient and predatory. When we combine, as Oxford University's Folashade Sube has, deep knowledge of West African bureaucracies with keen observation of how African officials negotiate with Chinese counterparts. When we spend several years honing Mandarin and Portuguese skills and digging into the complexities of Angolan management of Chinese lines of credit, as South African scholar Lucy Corkin did. I don't have a good name for this group, but I commend their research. And what they have given us is real and deep insights into the challenges and opportunities of Chinese banks and Chinese companies doing business in risky countries. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to introduce you to a little of the research that we are doing at the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, which I head, on those challenges and opportunities. And I'm going to try to do it, just to keep it lively. I'm going to try to build this around three Chinese sayings, just in honor of my time in Hong Kong studying Chinese, which has gotten quite rusty. But these three Chinese sayings, I think many people will be familiar with. The first one, crossing the river by feeling the stones. The second one, the mountains are high, the emperor is far away. This one I particularly like, 山高皇帝远. And then the third one, which I heard for the first time when I was talking to the president of the China Exim Bank, and he said to me that water that's too clear has no fish, when we were talking about corruption. So those three Chinese sayings are going to be part of how I'll structure the talk. And then I also, because things like to come in groups like this, and we are in talking about China, so we have three collective action problems, three Chinese sayings and three collective action problems: moral hazard, tragedy of the commons, and free riding. So we'll see how far I get with that. So a little bit on the historical context for lending in Africa. Debt in Sub-Saharan Africa has a long history and a troubled one. So you can see from this slide here that this is external debt as a percentage of gross national income. And you can see from 1970 up until 2018, this is all debt that Africa owed. So it got very, very high around 1994. So it's almost up to 80%. And then the red columns here are debt forgiveness or reduction by the international community. So that's, this is the, some of you might be familiar with the HIPC program. So that was when the World Bank and the IMF forgave quite a bit of debt. It also involved the Paris Club. But you can see all of those little bits of debt there. So this is part of the setup for moral hazard, which is the problem where, in this instance, it would be countries believing that their debt might be canceled or forgiven because they've had that experience recently, would borrow more than they should. So that's a little bit of the history. And here we have the growth rates and commodity prices. So these are recent years. You can see oil was quite high in 2011, over $100 a barrel, and then it sank down in 2016 to $40 a barrel. And copper prices have been, they didn't drop as far, but they've dropped quite a bit. And on the right-hand side, you can see growth rates. So those in there. And so growth rates are very sensitive to commodity prices in Africa. These are IMF projections. So they were projecting that there would be a sharp dip in 2020 and then it would rise again, so a V-shaped recovery. We don't actually know what's going to be happening in Africa, but this is the best guess right now about how the pandemic is going to affect things. So the first Chinese saying, 我只是头国和. So the Chinese actors, as I said, started in 1979, but it's been a very slow arrival in Africa. From 1979, the commercial contracts were first being reported, and they are now, as everyone's heard about it, but in 1979 it was small. And so this chart here is from our data on, it's a quick snapshot of our data on Chinese loan commitments in Africa. And as you can see, in 2000, it was almost invisible. And then we go up to the highest in 2016, which is quite anomalous. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it was crossing the river, crossing the ocean, as Bosch, as I put it, by experimenting. And this lending is going up and going down a little bit. So here, this tells you a little bit more about how the African growth rates are reflected and how the lending relates to that. So in the first years, African growth rates are pretty high. As you can see, they're up. Africa was rising at 4%, 5%, and it looked like a very promising environment for lending. And that wasn't just a Chinese assessment. This is what the world was all saying, that Africa was taking off. So the Chinese lending rose and rose and rose. And then as you can see in 2014, this all happens. And Chinese lending is kind of reacting like, what do we do now? And so if you look at the red, these are loan commitments to Angola. And it's important to take those out of the data because Angola is very different. Lending in Angola is very different from the rest of the continent. So if you look at the blue, that's all the other lending. And it's sort of, there's a reaction there. So it peaks in 2013 and then starts to go down and it flattens out and goes down a little bit in 2018. And our data for 2019 shows, again, a reduction, but not what you've been hearing from some others, that it's dried up completely. That's not what we're going to be reporting at our conference at the end of March. So I'm going to try to just show you very briefly, if I can get into this, the loan data. Yes. So this is our loan data. This is what gives me the ability to talk about these things. This is our database. It's totally available to the public. As you can see here, these are all the different countries that have borrowed, the number of loans, the value. And then if you go over to this part here, you can look at any particular country. You can see the different projects, and it's just a fabulous resource. And I'm really grateful to my team for all the work that they've done for this. You can download the whole data set. So great resource. Now back to the PowerPoint, if I can make that happen. There. So what's China's role in the current debt distress? So it's many people in the audience probably know that there is a multilateral framework now for handling this official bilateral debt in Africa and other low-income countries. And this was developed over the past year, over the pandemic year, through the group of 20, the G20, which China is a member, and the Paris Club has been part of this, World Bank, IMF, and so on. And so they've developed a framework for this. We can talk about that if you want in the Q&A. But so I'm going to dive more deeply into China's role here. So what is China actually doing? Who is lending in Sub-Saharan Africa's 39 low-income countries? So this is the data that's been released by the World Bank. So now I'm going to their data, which is in aggregate. But so here's where China sits here. So if you see from the blue is China. So 2014 to 2018, China's lending is going up there. It's quite similar to the World Bank. And then you've got other multilaterals there as well, other bilateral officials, other non-officials, and then bondholders, which start out small and are getting bigger and bigger. And so this is China, part of this picture, but not the dominant part. And here's the percentages. So China's bilateral official is 19% of the total in the low-income countries that are eligible for this G20 debt relief program. So those are the only ones that the World Bank had released data on, which is why I focused just on those countries. There are more than 30 in that data set. So the World Bank is the biggest lender there, 23%, and so on, other multilaterals. So together, 43% of the lending in those countries is multilateral banks. So what about China? They are very problematic part of the problem in a small but important number of countries. So this gives a little outline of Chinese debt as a percentage of public and publicly guaranteed debt. So this is government debt in 22 of the high risk or already in debt distressed countries. So this is our way of laying this out to show you which countries these are. So these are the ones that are in debt distress. So as you can see, the Chinese lending here, if you look at 20% and above, it's this group of countries that the Chinese lending is a big part of the problem. And then this group of debt distressed countries, Chinese lending is not that big and not that significant as a part of the problem. So just
hi Deborah, sorry to interrupt, but there is this distractive background noise on your side. I wonder if you can grab a mic or something just to see if it'll get better.
I don't have a mic. And there isn't any noise here.
Okay, then can you try to speak up a little bit?
Okay.
Thank
I'll
you.
try. You're welcome. It could be just my laptop. Okay, so in any case, these are the countries in which China is a minor lender. So I won't go through them all, but you can see it's quite a few, 14 out of those. It's small, 1% up to 18%. And then we've got, these are the problem countries. So there are 8 here. Zimbabwe isn't included in the World Bank's, the debt relief program because they're in arrears to the World Bank, but they are in debt distress and China has lent a lot there. So I'll go through that quickly because, so the next point I want to make is that Chinese debt relief in these countries is ongoing. So they're not actually free riding. There's been a lot of concern that they're going to free ride on the debt relief being provided by others. But in these 7 countries, and Zimbabwe is not part of this because they're not part of the debt relief, the DSSI, Chinese have been providing restructuring of loans. They've been doing debt relief. And they've been doing it since 2016 in the case of Angola. There. So in our research on Chinese debt relief, we have a paper that came out last year in which we looked at all of these different cases from 2003, and there's a lot of information about that. So I won't go into that in detail, but just to say that it's going on. And so these are debt cancellations that the Chinese government has done since 2000. So this it does 2 things. One, it shows that the Chinese are aware of debt problems. They have been canceling debt earlier. This debt is not related to current lending, but related to old lending that was going on in the 1970s and the 1980s. But it can create moral hazard because there is this idea now in these countries that the Chinese are coming and they're canceling these old loans. And not very high figures, as you can see. Some years it's in the millions, 10 million. Some years it's 595 million. This is across Africa. So it's not great numbers, but it does create a kind of precedent. And these are, again, the countries in which this debt restructuring has been going on in the different cases. So in the pre-COVID period, there was a lot of Chinese debt relief going on. We didn't find any asset seizures. There was no debt cancellation except for these interest-free loans that I laid out before. Those are all a small foreign aid part of Chinese lending. We also found multiple creditors, and that's going to matter in a minute. And there were separate negotiations. So there was no overarching China there were lots of different actors. And we also found that cancellation and restructuring were done loan by loan, not the entire debt portfolio. So there was a lot of work, a lot of discussions loan by loan for different projects that might be troubled. And the Sri Lanka case is one case like that. So there was a menu of options we found. Now, for the Shangao Huangdi Yuan part, the mountains are high, the emperor far away. So this multiple creditors creates some of the difficulties here, those separate negotiations, multiple creditors. And then the problem of moral hazard, the past Chinese debt cancellations in all of these countries. And I want you to notice Zambia here on the end. We'll come back to that later on in the next panel. But a number of different countries that have had this experience of having the Chinese cancel some of their debt. Now, the last few things that I'll say are about going back again to what's going to be, in a minute, you'll see how I'm going to bring Sanmao back into this story. So these are the gross annual revenues of Chinese companies' construction projects in Africa. And so you can see from 1998 here up to 2019, it's been growing very steeply. And so the Chinese lending is tied in closely, but it doesn't pay for all of these, but it stimulates this kind of work. There are multiple Chinese lenders and multiple stakeholders here. And so there are a lot, China is, we have to disaggregate China. And so when people keep talking about China's doing this, China's doing that, I always want to know what part of China, or what part of Beijing, what actors are we talking about here that are doing this? And there are a lot. We have more than 30 Chinese lenders of different kinds in our data. So now we get back to Sanmao. So this is a picture that was taken, that someone took of me. Again, people always seem to be taking pictures of me from the back doing research in Africa, but it's, and I'm not even sure what year this was taken, but it was in Mali and not that far from where Sanmao was in this picture. She was in the Western Sahara. And so I was in, not when this picture was taken, but I was in an African country in the capital in a hotel just a couple of years ago, a few years ago. And I heard her song, Ganlan Shu, coming out from a part of the restaurant. It was in the afternoon. And so I went over and it was a group of Chinese construction, not workers, but a group from a construction company. And they were all sitting together, putting together a bid on a project. And they were playing Chinese music and Ganlan Shu was playing. And so it was the start of an interesting conversation with them. But I hadn't heard that song for 30 years. So it was really lovely to have that happen there. So back again to our data. This shows our data by lender. So you can see that we have the Chinese government, we have Chinese companies coming in there in green. We've got the commercial banks in orange, then the two policy banks, China Development Bank and China Exim Bank. So there are a number of different actors. So I'll just conclude by saying that these different actors are creating some of these, they're creating some of the problem of tragedy of the commons, which I'm going to talk about on the next panel. But the problem of moral hazard, I think, is not so much the different actors here, but it is something that we can see now playing out. I'm going to make an argument for that in the next panel as well. And then the free riding as a collective action problem, I don't see this as much. of an issue, but that's certainly something that we can talk about in the Q&A. Thank you.
Terrific, Professor. Thank you very much for opening the 3-day workshop with a fantastic keynote. I don't know about other folks, but I have a long list of questions that are questions and issues that I would love to have you answer. But I know that we have a very tight schedule, and what the organizers have asked is if everyone can just hold tight with their questions. We're going to take a very quick 5-minute break here. So those of us here in Victoria, we're going to come back together here at 5:45 sharp. That gives us, I'm being very strict here with a 4-minute break. And the folks in Hong Kong, same thing with you in terms of a very quick 4-minute break. If you just want to get up and stretch your legs or get a glass of water, then we're going to come back together and go right into the first panel. If you have any questions for Deborah based on her presentation now or the presentation in the panel, you get a chance to ask them during the Q&A at the panel. So if you can all just join me in a virtual clap to say thank you very much. And in 4 minutes time, we'll come back together for the first panel discussion. Thanks, folks. See you in 4 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I'm the moderator of the first panel. My name is C.K. Lee, and I'm currently a faculty at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. It's my great pleasure to introduce the 2 other speakers on the panel because Professor Clark has already introduced Professor Brottingham. I'm not going to waste time on that. So let me just go to introduce to you Professor Gu Bin, who is an associate professor of international law in Beijing Foreign Studies University. He used to work with the World Trade Organization and the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. Dr. Gu's research interests are international trade and financial law and global economic governance. His recent monograph is The Law and Governance of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. He has consulted for the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, the Chinese Ministry of Finance, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Then we have Professor Stephen Harder, who is Professor of Practice of Law at NYU Shanghai. He teaches courses in international law and institutions, comparative constitutions, and investments in developing countries with a special focus on Chinese investments in Africa. Prior to teaching at NYU Shanghai, Professor Harder practiced international law for 30 years, advising on cross-border financings between China and Africa and South America, as well as investments into China by European, Japanese, and US corporations. He has written on political finance in the US and on Chinese sovereign wealth fund. So we have 3 experts here, and I think I'll turn the floor first to Professor Gu Bin, and it will be followed by Professor Deborah Brottingham, and then Professor Stephen Harder. Professor Gu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Lee. It's a great honor for me to join this distinguished panelists, and thanks for my old friend at HLS for inviting me to this forum. So basically, these years I have been studying the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank law, and recently I'm working on the soft law and standards regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. So today I want to talk a little bit about the debt sustainability under the Belt and Road Initiative from a legal perspective. As you know, the Belt and Road Initiative has embarked upon a new phase of development since the second Belt and Road Forum in 2019, after 6 years of initial growth. This new phase places the term high quality at the heart. Then people would wonder, what's the definition of high quality and how to measure it? In my theory, a high quality Belt Road Initiative may be measured by 3 dimensions. First, debt sustainability. Second, environmental and social safeguards. Third, open and transparent project procurements. Here, I will address the issue of debt sustainability under the Belt Road Initiative from a legal perspective. But first, I need to lay out a basic economics. Debt is instrumental investment in the eyes of development finance. It may temporarily be a burden upon the borrower, while in the long run, it benefits the borrower as a productive investment. But sometimes when the investment goes sour, the debt may become unsustainable. Therefore, debt sustainability is essentially an art of balancing to meet the needs of the borrower while making sure that the debt is repayable and the lender is protected. In context of the Belt Road Initiative, debt sustainability is practically important. Such importance may be analyzed from 2 perspectives. One is related to the rhetoric or stigma of debt trap diplomacy imposed upon the Belt Road Initiative. This rhetoric started from Habatoda report by an India think tank in 2017 and amplified by a few others. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2018 and the Chatham House of Great Britain in 2020 disproved this rhetoric forcefully in their respective interviews with FT, their research reports. A traditional method of measuring debt risk is debt to GDP ratio. When the debt of a country is over 60% of its GDP, it is considered to be risky. Below 60 is safe. A research by the Center for Global Development, based in, I guess it's in Washington, D.C., in 2018 examined 68 Belt Road countries. Among them, 8 would be in debt distress if all their committed Belt Road loans were distributed. However, the use of debt to GDP as a ratio as a measurement for debt sustainability has been criticized recently for 2 reasons. First, this measurement fails to consider whether a loan will be used for consumption or investment. When it is used for investment, as in a BI project, it is expected to generate financial returns for loan repayments while benefiting local economy and people's welfare. Debt sustainability is therefore merited. The second reason for criticizing the 60% as a benchmark for debt sustainability is that the ratio is outdated. So the interest rates today is very low worldwide compared with the much higher interest rates when the 60% ratio was first introduced by Europeans in 1990s. At that time, in 1990s, the interest rate was 7%. Now it's near 0. So a much higher ratio than 60% may be feasible today. The second perspective to see the practical importance of debt sustainability is the G20 debt suspension initiative last year in the context of the pandemic COVID-19, as Deborah just mentioned. China had been an active player in making the G20 initiative possible. In fact, it marked the first time for the Chinese government to join a multilateral debt treatment framework. Among the 73 eligible countries under the G20 initiative, 59 has signed Belt Road agreements with China, and their debt owed to China occupies 30% of their total foreign debt due by the end of 2020. Therefore, China's role in the G20 initiative is also important for the success of the Belt Road Initiative. Debt sustainability is so important that the international community has made various campaigns to address it. In those campaigns, soft law is the dominant method of regulating sovereign debt under international law. Soft law is not legally binding, but it is quick in making and efficient in implementation. Such soft law endeavors include, first, principles of promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing by APCAT in 2012. Second, Debt Sustainability Framework, or DSF, by the World Bank and the IMF to measure the debt situations in low-income countries. Third, principles relating to debt rescheduling and canceling upheld by the Paris Club. And fourth, and most recently, analytical framework of debt sustainability under the Belt Road Initiative initiated by Chinese Ministry of Finance. The China proposed analytical framework combines best international practice and the particular situations of the Belt Road borrowing countries. The innovation there lies in a clear favor of looking at the debt from long-term perspective. These soft law endeavors are helpful for debt sustainability, but not sufficient. And more work needs to be done. Here are my few suggestions. The first one is China proposed analytical framework of debt sustainability should be multilateralized. And it may be used by the MCDF, a new multilateral institution for development finance hosted by the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to measure the debt situations along the Belt Road countries and beyond. Second, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank needs to be drawn upon in terms of debt sustainability analysis in its project documents. AIIB is a ready and shining example of prioritizing debt sustainability analysis when considering a project proposal. And third suggestion is China should begin the negotiation of joining the Paris Club as soon as possible. As you know, the Paris Club is the most important international platform to treat bilateral official debt. China should not be kept out of it for long, since it becomes an increasingly important creditor internationally. By joining it, China will benefit in terms of debt management and transparency. It is also good for the club by absorbing China's long-term view regarding debt as a productive investment. So the fourth suggestion is a global sustainability fund should be set up. This global sustainability fund aims to bail out those countries in debt distress. Where the money would come from? It may come from the issuance of bonds through the platform World Bank or voluntary donation by globally systematically important banks on the G-SIB, or big internet companies like GAFA. This idea of the fund is daring and is inspired by the European sustainability mechanism established during the European debt crisis in 2012. And my final suggestion is that the PPP, the modus operandi of public-private partnership, should be continuously be enhanced and promoted in the BI projects. I guess those 5 suggestions will help Belt Road Initiative to achieve that sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gu. And now let me turn to Professor Brautigam. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to my water that's too clear has no fish. And I want to talk briefly, this is a follow-up, I think, on some of these challenges of debt sustainability by looking at two countries in Africa that are two of the highest, two of the most problematic in terms of Chinese lending. And what I've been doing with research that we'll be talking about it at our own conference, which will be over April and May, I've been digging much more into Zambia. And Angola, though, is also a very interesting case. So I'm going to mention them both briefly here. And I'm actually very interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say about all of this. So I hope I'm not going to be talking for all that long. So muddy water in Angola and Zambia. So I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the charges that in what was thought to happen in Hambantota, that this kind of asset seizure would happen in Africa. And so we see different kinds of fears coming up, and we can talk more about the details of that. But Zambia in particular is one of those. So Zambia, as you can see in this little clip here from a Zambian newspaper, that Zambia was, there was fear that ZESCO, the country's electricity company, might be taken over after defaulting on loan repayment. Well, at that time, Zambia hadn't defaulted on anything, but that's not the case anymore. So I've been looking into this, into ZESCO, into the lending, and I won't be able to tell you a whole lot about it, but I'll tell you a little bit at a bigger, the bigger picture here. So one of the things that's happening here is, in terms of people's ability to understand this, is also one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be on this panel and with these people, is that international project finance law is very complex. And my whole vocabulary about this has been changing and growing. And so this is what I've been learning. It's like a whole new language. So, but escrow accounts, non-recourse financing, contingent liabilities, offtake arrangements, sovereign immunity, cross-default clauses, BOTs, BOOTs, and PPPs, which are build, operate, transfer, build, own, operate, transfer, and public-private partnerships that Professor Gu just talked about here. Special purpose vehicles, or SPVs. And all of these are hard concepts. So they're not that straightforward, and not everybody who's been looking at Chinese lending has gone to Harvard and studied these kinds of contract laws. So it's hard to understand. So that's one issue that's going on. These are things that the foreign aid community hasn't really been doing much on, and then certainly civil society is not used to these kinds of concepts either. So then we have all of these Chinese actors that I mentioned before. So these multiple Chinese lenders and multiple stakeholders here. And they're now, again, as Professor Gu suggested, that there should be more PPPs. Chinese actors in Africa are really going after these public-private partnerships. And they're taking all of these different kinds of complex forms. And so these are things that it's created a lot of fear, I think, and also lack of understanding, but it also has created some real problems. And I won't be able to go into details again about that, but it's very interesting and also troubling. So the reason why I'm picking these two countries, well, first of all, as you saw earlier, Angola is a very, very large recipient of Chinese lending. For the whole continent of Africa, 32% of the Chinese loan commitments in our database are for Angola. So it's very large. And then looking at the countries that are eligible for the debt service suspension initiative, this multilateral G20 program that Professor Gu and I have both talked about, Angola is 41% of all the Chinese lending, the debt service that was due in 2020. For the countries that were eligible for that program, 41% of all the debt service due to China was due just to Angola. And so Angola is very large. As you can see over there, Zambia is much smaller in terms of the overall problem, but it's significant. And then Kenya is the next one. Kenya and Ethiopia are the next. And then the others all go together into that 1.41 billion. So they may be not as much the problem, but so Angola. And then this is the sectors financed by Chinese lending. it's 70% in just for infrastructure areas. So on the one hand, transport, power, telecoms, water, these are all areas that African countries and African citizens really need. The infrastructure deficit in Africa is it's over $100 billion a year. So they can really use help in this area. But on the other hand, infrastructure, along with mining, natural resources, are the two sectors of activity that tend to have the highest corruption. And so that's creating difficulties and challenges. So again, here's Angola, as I mentioned before. You can see the Angolan loans there. Angola has actually, I think, they're the biggest borrower. They have benefited quite a bit. And I'm going to see if I can just show you again the loan data here. So let's go into that. So we hover over Angola. So 256 loans. Let's see what Angola looks like. Okay, so these are all the different sectors. And if you come out here, these are the different projects. So hospitals, roads, secondary schools, transmission lines, a lot of electricity, different, the Palace of Justice courthouse for the lawyers among you, some different kinds of equipment that have come in, water supply. It's so many different things that are going on, you know, project after project in there. So that's a lot. So the Angolans have borrowed they've committed anyway to borrow $46 billion from the Chinese, but they have gotten quite a bit for it. So I think that it's, on the whole, it's not been a bad deal for them. Of course, it depends what is the cost of these projects, you know, how much kickbacks are going to the contractors, what's the quality, all those things matter, of course. But at the end of the day, I think most of Angola's partners were just purchasing the oil and then sending the money back to Angola, and they had no idea what Angola would do with it. But what the Chinese did with this oil secured credit lines is it was tied to Chinese finance being tied to Chinese companies doing the work. And so the oil going from Angola to China, some of that was used to repay loans. And so let's look a little bit at, so this is the China's oil imports from Angola in the blue line here versus the lending. So you can see that there is, in the early years up until 2016, there's really ample room here for using some of that oil to repay these loans. And so it didn't look like it was very burdensome on Angola, and it looked like it was the proverbial win-win arrangement there. And then you see 2016, and this is what's happening here is defensive lending by China Development Bank. So they've suddenly, Angola's, the oil price dropped precipitously, and that's the value of the oil also drops in that that time period there, as I mentioned earlier. And then Angola's having trouble financing its loan. So this starts in 2015 and the response happens in 2016. It actually happened in December 2015. So it's right at the end of that year. So, so that's the problem in Angola. It benefited a lot from the lending, now is having trouble. And then if you take a patient capital perspective, I think that a Chinese view might be that it'll recover. And you know, they can go back to this relationship that they've had for quite a bit longer, I imagine. Zambia. Now, Zambia presented a puzzle to me when I was looking at our data, and I'll show you why. So this is a chart that we did we actually did this first several years ago. I think it was 2018 when we first analyzed this. And what you see here is let's see, it's the total Chinese loan commitments as a percentage of gross national income along the y-axis here. And then at the bottom, it's external debt as a percentage of gross national income. And as Professor Gu mentioned, the standard cutoff is if it's over 60%, then that's countries in debt, it's much more risky. And then there's a lot of controversy about that. And as he nicely laid out, not everyone agrees with that assessment, but it's a kind of rough and ready figure here. And so if you see all this small number of countries that are in this area here, and then the ones where the Chinese lending is high, it's this quadrant up here. So we know Djibouti, it's such a tiny place. It's under 1 million people. Anytime you make a loan there, it's going to be big. I mean, and they were the other part of the Ethiopia Railway. So that ends up being, that's pretty understandable. Then you've got Angola here. And the Republic of Congo is also an interesting case, which we've been looking into. But you've got these 4 cases up in this quadrant here that don't fit the rest of the picture. And so I got very interested in Zambia. Why is Zambia this outlier here? And so I've been exploring that. And this is my very first order explanation. So this is Chinese lending to Zambia by lender. So we've got from 2010 to 2019 here. And you see what's happening here is a lot of different actors. So this is the my picture of the tragedy of the commons going on in Zambia. So you've got all of these Chinese lenders, and there are more Chinese lenders in Zambia. There are 15. In our whole database, we only have 30 all across Africa. Zambia is by far the largest number of lenders of any of the countries in our database. So there are more Chinese lenders operating there in Zambia, financing these different projects, and they're not coordinating it. And so that's a coordination problem. It's a collective action problem. And so, and then you can see the years there, 2016 and 2017, after the economy was already tanking, why did the lending still continue in those 2 years there? And that's something that's puzzling as well. That's something that needs to be figured out yet. But when we think of, so we'll just go on to Zambia, there's this interesting history in Zambia. There's a long history. And one part of it is that Zambia was also one of the locations for Tazara, the railway. And so the Chinese companies are familiar with Zambia. The construction companies have been working there for a long time. So Zambia was first in a lot of things. They were first to have a first Chinese mining investment overseas. They were first to get the railway overseas. They were first to have Chinese agricultural investments in Africa, the first in all of these. And now they're the first country to default on Chinese lending in the current period. So it doesn't, I still think it's an outlier compared to some of the others, but I think that's some of what's going on here. And then this is Chinese lending to Zambia by lender. So another thing that is happening, I think, is defensive lending, and we can talk about that more also, but the loans have started. And so how do you get repaid? Well, you have to finish these projects. And so they keep on, or you have to help with new projects that are going to earn money. As Professor Gu again pointed out, this idea of development sustainability, that these projects will eventually earn money. But I think the political economy of Zambia is such that that kind of assumption is very problematic. So the last thing that's going on in Zambia is also interesting. I told you it would come back again. This is a country, Zambia is a country that has the largest number of Chinese debt cancellations in the past and the largest value. And so on the Zambian side, there is probably this experience of having the Chinese cancel their debt. And so this, on this side, it also seems to be that there's something going on that's different about Zambia compared to the other parts of Africa. So that's where I conclude. And I'm delighted to hear the last speaker and then get to discussing some of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brautigam. So next, we have our last speaker for the first panel, Professor Stephen Harder.
Thanks very much. And if everyone can hear me clearly, just give me a thumbs up. That would help me to know that. Good. It's such an honor to be here with Professor Gu and Professor Browdigan. And I'm so interested to hear Professor Gu reference the AIIB and also the Paris Club. And maybe during the discussion, we can talk about both those very interesting aspects of things. And I was delighted also that Professor Browdigan focused on Zambia, because in preparing for today, I thought I would take a look at the statistics that were just updated by the World Bank only a few days ago about Zambia. And I was particularly interested to look at this issue, which we often hear in the market, that the bondholders are worried that somehow they're going to get a bad deal because China is getting a good deal. And so I took a look at the figures for Zambia. And if you look at the line items for Zambia, and they're all, I won't put them up here, but you can look at them on your own. They're easy to find now with the World Bank. But that, as Professor Browdigan was saying, it's very clear that over the last several years in Zambia, it looks as if the total outstanding for the bilateral loans that China has extended and also the non-official loans have both been being rolled over. And what that means in each case is that China is foregoing payment. I'll say China, but it's not really China. It's China Exim or CDB. They're foregoing payment of pretty close to $750 million a year. At the same time, and over the same last 2 years, the bondholders, the public bondholders, who have $3 billion of principal outstanding, have been receiving about $250 million a year in interest payments. They've been receiving that while the Chinese have been foregoing payment on their debt. So in Zambia, in fact, just to underline what a lot of the work that Professor Browdigan's group at CARI have done, is that the Chinese have actually been quite lenient, in many ways, quite reasonable about how they've treated their debt. And this is true in many other countries. In some of the other countries that are on the list, Ethiopia, for instance, interestingly, one group of Chinese creditors seems to have been foregoing payment while the other group of Chinese creditors was being paid down. And I think this also underlines something that was just said, which is that China is not a single monolithic being. And in fact, within China, there's competition, there's ministerial jealousies, all sorts of things going on, which means they don't always coordinate as well as they might, as Professor Browdigan was saying. I come to this personally from having worked for about 4 years on the Polish debt restructuring in the 90s, when Poland was able to lower the net present value of their outstanding debt by something like 45%. And I do believe that we're going to find out, and it doesn't matter that I believe it, I think that some very important economists believe it too, that we're going to find out in the next several years that the debt is unsustainable on a national level at a number of these African countries that China has lent to. We're not going to find, as many people have indicated, Chinese banks writing off commercial loans this year and next year. I don't think that's what they're going to do, but eventually there will need to be some kind of restructuring if these countries are going to have a sustainable debt burden. It's happened before in other parts of the world, and it's going to happen in Africa. If that's the case, I'd just like to mention a couple things, really to lay out for perhaps the panel discussion or questions from the distinguished audience at some point. And that is that when some of these African countries are sitting across the table from big Chinese banks or the Chinese ambassador or the president of China, they should remember that when China had difficulties with debt repayments in the 1990s, when Guangdong Enterprises went bankrupt, Zhu Rongji allowed it to go bankrupt, allowed it to go through a workout, and allowed it to have a significant debt write-off, and did not allow the sovereign government to back it up. In other words, it also allowed a restructuring of the debt to occur and a reduction in net present value. The other thing I think the African countries, many of them, can look at going forward is that At the same time, for infrastructure projects in China, when China was trying to build with foreign debt financing, the project finance regs of 1997 in China very much indicated that if it was going to be foreign financed, if Chinese companies were going to owe debt overseas, one, the national government would not back it up. Two, it had to be open and competitive tenders for those deals. And that's a kind of project-based rigor that the Chinese insisted on in their, when they were inviting in foreign investment to build their infrastructure. And I think that when the time comes, I think many African countries will be able to learn from that. And I think China will be able to teach them a great deal about that. I do think at some point there will be very difficult negotiations between some of these countries, perhaps Zambia and others, with the Chinese banks. And I think from my experience, it's somewhat less moral hazard discussions as, well, we can come back to moral hazard, as simply negotiating leverage. And I'd like to suggest a couple things. One is that I don't think, from my discussions with some African academics and people who look at these issues, I sometimes think that they don't really appreciate all the strength of their own sovereignty. And when we have discussions about seizures of assets, which are in many cases not, let's say in good faith, and often coming from the US side and for reasons that have nothing to do with truth in the world. But when we hear discussions of seizures of assets or resource-based financing, just to make a legal point and a point about sovereignty, if there's a decision not to pay a loan, which is a contract, it's legally the same as a decision not to follow whatever resource contract you've entered into. Both can be renegotiated at the same time or in the same manner based on the sovereignty of the country. And there's no sense in which any legal document can overcome the sovereignty of a country to simply say no, whether it's a port, a mine, the privatization of an asset. China cannot force Zambia or any other country to do that. They have sovereignty. The Chinese side is very keen on its own sovereignty, and I think the African side of these negotiations is going to realize that their sovereignty is a very strong negotiating point. I'd just like to say that in a negotiation on debt sustainability, and in fact on debt restructuring, each side of the table has some unstated things that they believe they know is true about the other side, but they don't say them. It's either impolite or they don't have to say them. And then there's some things they say across the table. And I think that the unstated position of some of the African countries for some of these projects that have been financed, as was just alluded to by Professor Browdigan, is that for some of these projects, not all of them, but for some of them, there was perhaps a poor feasibility study before they were done. They were perhaps overpriced. And at the time they were done, almost the entire economic benefit to GDP went to Chinese players. In other words, a Chinese bank lent money to a Chinese construction company. The steel might have come from China, the cement might have come from China. And so there was very little impact on the African economy. And I think that the African side, unstated, will also realize that for China, there are many benefits to these loans that are not purely financial, whether it be diplomatic or support for China in various international organizations, or the fact that in the 5 or 6 or 7 years that much of this investment has been going on, it was extremely helpful to the Chinese economy, which had over investment in various sectors and so forth. The other thing is that we've seen recently, and it'd be very interesting to hear later what other people think about that. There seems to be a very steep drop off in the last year or two in the kind of Chinese lending that we've been talking about today. Not from a moral standpoint, but from a business standpoint. If a Chinese if an African party is across the table from a Chinese party, Chinese bank, and thinks that future lending will be small, or even future investment will be small, there's much less incentive to negotiate the current debt. Similarly, if much of the political benefit when that debt was incurred was 10 years ago or 5 years ago in your own country, if you're the new leader of that country, there's not as much political benefit in paying the debt as there was in assuming the debt. And so there are various dynamics that go on that may make it very difficult for the Chinese banks to actually, as in the years that are coming, to get full payment on some of this debt. And not to get too lawyerly, but countries like Argentina and Venezuela, they have to worry about significant assets of their own in the countries of their creditors. Most of the African countries, I think, do not have significant assets in China. And so there are lots of reasons why these negotiations may not go as other ones have gone in the past. But to be fair, on the Chinese side of the equation, they also have constraints. And these I'm not as sure about, but we might speculate that in some cases, either SASAC or the Ministry of Finance may be constraining CDB or China Exim or the commercial banks as to what they can agree to for accounting reasons and for other reasons. And this may also be a constraint on them. And of course, there may be political constraints that we're not aware of. But if that all sounds negative, I hope it doesn't. I hope it sounds realistic. But I think, and with humility, I hope suggest this, China has a tremendous opportunity in this situation over the next several years to take the initiative at FOCAC coming up, with the Paris Club potentially, and to say that going forward, China would like to use some of the principles of the AIIB, that China would like to be a leader in Africa for ethical and economically efficient investment, that Chinese contractors and developers would like to be an international consortia to get the bids in Africa, which has a lot of good effects on transparency and so forth. And that in fact, China is already doing a great deal to alleviate the debt burden of these countries. And China will expect, for instance, the multilaterals and the World Bank to put more pressure on the bondholders to do what they should do, that China's already done a lot for these countries in terms of relief of debt. And the bondholders have actually benefited from that in the last several years in ways that they may not realize or wish to say. So I'm hoping that that stimulates some conversation, and I'm of course available. I am a project finance lawyer, or was, and so at a different time, for a very small fee, I'd be happy to talk to Professor Browdigan about all those things she was mentioning. But at that, I will pause and hope to hear more from the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Harder. And I'd like to thank all the three speakers on this panel. We have, because of your expertise and experiences, I think we have a really lots of food for thought, as well as lots of data, aggregate data about the debt situation, particularly in Zambia, and also the multiple players who were behind these debts, as well as from Professor Gu about the soft laws or the regulations, and then from Professor Harder, the negotiation side of things. So we do have different pieces of the same kind of situation and puzzle about debt sustainability. And I'm particularly heartened to hear about the update of Zambia, because I spent some time in that country and just was heartbroken lately learning that the country has defaulted the Euro bond. And it seems to me that's a wholly different story than the Chinese debt that people talk about most of the time, not aware that the Zambian government has taken a lot of risk issuing those bonds, which is very high interest rate, and that account for quite a bit of its sustainability problem. I will open the floor in a minute very soon, because I know many of you are really eager to pose your questions after hearing so many interesting presentations. But I just overall, and I like to pick up on something what Professor Harder mentioned in his remark, that as a sociologist coming into this kind of topic and spending time on the ground, looking at behind the scenes of how some of these debts were negotiated, about the terms, like do they have good feasibility studies before signing those debt? Bidding, do they have bidding? Yes, we know that Chinese loans come with this clause that only Chinese contractors and suppliers could be used. But the time when I was doing the research, everybody in Zambia was complaining, government officials in particular, that there was no bidding among these Chinese suppliers. You have to use Chinese suppliers, but then there was no bidding involved. And as a result, all the price tags for all the projects were inflated. So what I like to ask, not so much to the panelists, but perhaps more broadly in the literature or the studies of these debt problems, do we have research that look into the making of these debts? It seems to me that the processes, the mechanisms, the dynamics, the relationships that went into the making of these debts would be at the roots of the problems. And though we have tons of aggregate data on numbers, the amounts of debt, the types of debt, but it seems to me there is a dearth of research that would really reveal, and we're going to solve these problems of debt sustainability, then at least we need to know what went wrong in the process of these debts before they became debt. And my own research suggests that really you have to look at who actually initiated the debt, whose interests were at stake, and who has bargaining power and not, and government ministries, do they impose certain conditions to make these debt more sustainable? And critical issue at my time, at least, was about bidding among these Chinese contractors and feasibility studies, of course. So my overall question is, how do we know, or do we have data, research looking into the mechanics, the process, the mechanisms of the making of debt? And so that's my general question to the panelists. And then I would like to put to the table a question I get from the Q&A box to Professor Brodigan. Does Chinese government encourage lenders and stakeholders to invest in Africa? If yes, what's the main purpose? And there is another question, is not addressed particularly at any of the speakers, but I think the panelists may want to answer. Can the common pool of resources in the African loans be refined via Schumpeterian efforts? I don't know if the question, the participant could elaborate on that. And then we have a long question, 2 questions for, I think, Professor Brodigan about the loan database by Carey. Some countries, for instance, Tanzania, do not have any data for that period. What might be the problem for that? And how do we try to go around such challenges in trying to understand the estimated total of loan commitment to Africa? And then the second question, in trying to assist African countries address the debt issue, China seems to be adopting some strategies, including PPP. But a particular financing module adopted recently for Ghana is a resource for infrastructure barter trade kind of arrangement. China, through Sino-Hydro, is financing Ghana's infrastructure with US $3 billion over a period while Ghana pays back with bauxite. The arrangement has been described as not a loan and does not count towards Ghana's debt. I don't know whether it's a question, but that's the question I get. maybe we should start with these, and then I will report a couple more as they come in. Anyone want to take up any of these issues? The panelists?
Why don't I take just the first one on the projects, Professor Lee, the focus on the project underlying the debt, just briefly. Often we do a lot of our analysis where we, oh, sorry, I'm on mute, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
Did you mean process or project?
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah, sorry. Yes, the projects. In other words, we have the data on the debt because the whole world collects data on debt, and the World Bank and everyone else, and it's tremendously useful, and one can learn a lot from it. China seems to be of two, I'm going to say China, forgive me, but the Chinese, the main players in China, CDB, the China Exim, and maybe people behind them seem to be of two minds. Do they wish to treat a country and all their debt in that country in a consistent way, or do they wish to negotiate project by project, loan by loan? And there are benefits to both, there are issues about both sides. If they wish to negotiate project loan by project loan, it is a legitimate question for the African side to say, let's take a look at the project when it was done, let's audit it and see, was it done for a fair price? And there are some examples around the world which would indicate that when there isn't a proper limit, the price can be highly inflated. But of course, when prices are inflated, often people on both sides have benefited in perhaps an illegitimate way, and therefore the African side may not wish to get into that issue. But one thing that could be considered is to say to the contractor, to the beneficiary of that contract, take on some of the debt. You had an extraordinary benefit. You have many business relationships with CDB or China Exim or ICBC back in China. You have many relationships with them around the world. This was $1 billion contract. It hasn't worked out economically. You should take 30% of the debt. And you pay it off, and you work it out with CDB, because we think that would be a fairer understanding of the underlying project. That might be one way in which you could get to the underlying projects. But I think on a global sense, because there's not so much data, the institutions tend to focus on the debt, and you can understand why it might be advantageous in some projects that have a question mark over them to focus on the debt and not the project. But there is one other aspect, and that is if you do project by project negotiation, it does make it more possible on the borrower side, again, for corruption to enter in. Because to take a hypothetical, if China decided as a matter of policy that they were going to renegotiate all their government debt with a country for, let's say, a 20% NPV, net present value reduction, then there'd be no discretion debt by debt. But if there's discretion debt by debt, it's extraordinarily valuable to the creditor if they can establish an illegitimate relationship with the government official to get a better deal, debt by debt, project by project. So, but just the last point is because different banks in China think they'll benefit in different ways. We saw, I think I mentioned, and you can see when you look at for instance, Ethiopia, that the Chinese bilateral banks were foregoing debt payments, while at the same time the commercial banks were receiving them. Clearly, those two banks have, if you will, different interests, and they would like to stay project by project. But it introduces the questions I've been mentioning. Yeah.
The other two panelists responding to the questions, Deborah.
Yeah, I can step in and and I want to just first of all address this issue about the bidding. And it's very true that there are many cases in which Chinese companies get projects and they develop them without any bidding. It's a kind of request-based model. It's how Japan used to operate also. it's they go and they develop the project, they bring it in to get finance. That's not how it always works. Even in Zambia, the Kafua Gorge, for example, it had an international tender with 15 companies participating, and then 5 of them were shortlisted, and then Sino-Hydro won the contract. It's $1.94 billion contract. But there are a lot of irregularities there, and there were so many irregularities that another Chinese company that was shortlisted sued because of those irregularities. So that's part of this tragedy of the commons that I've been observing now, with this, just all of these intense fighting, you know, to get in this one pool, and all of them trying to get this business. So I've been focusing on that for the last few days, so it's really fresh in my mind. So that's, and then also about China Exim Bank, because all of these creditors have their own personalities, and just as, you know, there's no one China, there's no one Chinese bank. They're an export credit agency, and the way export credit agencies work around the world is pretty much they don't develop projects. They fund projects that their exporters develop. Mm-hmm. And so that's actually quite normal for that process to go on. And I don't know if there's any kind of requirement about other export credit agencies that they have to take part in multiple, you know, in bidding for those contracts. I don't know if that's a standard. It's an interesting thing to explore. I'll look into that. Maybe Stephen knows. But and just to say thank you so much for saying that someone needs to do research on that, because that is what I'm doing research on, like how did the debt develop? And your work has been so helpful, you know, in just laying this out in Zambia. And that's so, it's interesting that that's the place that's also been very puzzling for me to start there too. So in the Ghana case, let me just talk about that briefly, the question from Evans. Well, first of all, he asked something about the countries in the loan database. I'm not sure if he's talking about our database, because Tanzania is fully represented in our database. So it's there with all of its data, unless somehow it disappeared overnight, but it should be there. You can check it out. But in terms of this Ghana financing mode, it's one that's been used. It is kind of new, and I don't know the actual details of that contract, but the IMF appeared to say, okay, this is not, we're not going to count this as debt. Whereas in other loan financed arrangements like that, where that was a future flow receivables transaction, I use some of this language that I've been learning, they did count that as a debt. And so there's something different about the way that contract was formulated, so that the IMF could say, okay, this is, but why, but it certainly seems to be a contingent liability of some kind, you know, some kind of, maybe there's no government guarantee on it. So that could be the thing that makes it not into something that they're counting. But that's a really interesting case. So it could be that Sino-Hydro is trusted in the Ghanaian context, that they are going to actually do this. They've been working there a long time. I don't know. It's another really interesting case. And all of the detail about how these things work is really quite fascinating, if hard to get. So thanks for bringing up that case. We'll see. It's a case where Ghana's future bauxite will repay infrastructure that's being carried out right now.
Professor Gu, maybe he's away for the moment. Let me go to the two other.
Professor Lee, I wonder if I can step in and pose some questions very quickly. Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you for all the panelists and moderator for this very enlightening discussion. I enjoyed it. I have many thoughts, but in the interest of time, I'll just summarize my questions for each panelist as briefly as possible. So for Professor Gu, or if he's not, he's away for a moment, I'll just ask the questions for Deborah and Stephen ahead, and then address my question for Professor Gu in a moment. So for Deborah, I wonder, and this echoes one of the questions posed by our audience from the floor, that I wonder if you could quickly elaborate on the point about the tragedy of commons that you mentioned briefly during the keynote, but you didn't elaborate during the panel discussion. And secondly, I appreciate the point about the heterogeneity of the personality of different lenders and actors from the Chinese side. But I wonder if you could give us a few examples to sort of contextualize our thinking here. For instance, what are the terms and preferences posed by different lenders, say CDB versus Exim Bank? And do they offer different terms, or do they focus on different countries? What are the interest rates or duration of grace period, or the conditionality, say, to tie a loan to a Chinese contractor? Is that a common practice for all the lenders, or just a particular practice for Exim Bank, for example? So I wonder if you could elaborate on that. And for Stephen, two questions as well. The first is, I really like the example that you used for Chinese past development experience, say the privatization of the state sector in Guangdong, and also the project-based negotiation insisted by the Chinese government when it was receiving international finance. And I wonder, have you seen the Chinese government to be, say, practicing a sort of double standard when it's now transitioning to become a lender rather than a borrower for international finance? Do you see that it's being practicing a different sort of approach to international financing or negotiation when its own interest has changed over time? And the second question is that it also relates to your point about the pros and cons for adopting a project by project negotiation or a more consistent or regional sort of manner of negotiation when it comes to Chinese lending and borrowing from African countries. So one possible explanation that I could have for the African countries to prefer a project-based or a more individualized approach to negotiation is that they may also be some kind of competition among African countries for lending from China. Say for the construction of railway projects, we do see that a level of competition was observed in the East African region when Kenya and Uganda were trying to secure loans from China to build their own railway. But on the other hand, the Tanzanian government was also planning a similar railway in that region to boost its own economy. And there may be competition in the future for the two railways. And of course, they're both considering the Chinese government as one of the most likely lenders to finance those projects. So those are my questions for Stephen and Deborah. And when Professor Gu is back, I will post my questions for him. Thank you.
Should I go first to
Please, Deborah, you go first.
Okay, so let me explain the tragedy of the commons. Just I'm not sure everybody understands what that is. The tragedy of the commons is a notion that you have a common resource of some kind, say like a common grazing area. And the tragedy is that it isn't regulated, so that too many people take their cows to graze on the commons, and then they eat up all the grass, and then there's no grass left, and so everybody suffers. So it's a collective action problem, because everybody would be better off if there were regulations of some kind, but they don't. So there's a worse outcome. And so in the case, to relate this to Zambia and the Chinese lending, what I see is a pool of, Zambia has projects, different kinds of things it wants to do for development. And there are all these Chinese actors competing to do these different projects, and there is no regulation or control. So the tragedy of the commons can be solved by the different actors regulating themselves. So therefore, like all the Chinese companies in Zambia would, regulate themselves and have some kind of taking turns of this, so they're not all viciously competing for these projects. Or it can be regulated by the Zambian government, which, could be more responsible about its lending, and the Ministry of Finance could just say to all the ministers, no, we're not going to give you money for this. Or it could be regulated in China, so the Chinese banks could say, no, you've got to do a better job of this. So nobody's regulating that, which creates this tragedy of the commons there. So that's what I see happening there more intensely than in any other country in Africa. In terms of the heterogeneity, you can get lots of that data on our website, but because we have the terms of the different loans, just sort on China Development Bank and compare that, for where we have the data. But just as a general sense, China Development Bank always gives commercial loans. So they may be very low interest, they may be higher interest, they're always commercial, and they vary in their interest rates. They're always, and China Exim Bank is the only part of the Chinese government, well now there's CIDCA, which is the China International Development Cooperation Agency. They and China Exim Bank give the only concessional loans, the only subsidized loans out of the Chinese government. And there's much more, I see the China Exim Bank is much more of a policy bank in terms of, you can see the hand of the Chinese government shaping what Exim Bank does. That's not so clear with China Development Bank. There's much less of a pattern in their lending. There's much, so China Development Bank is in far fewer countries. They suss out the commercial aspects of the lending much more carefully, I think, because they're not so policy driven. And they're, even in Zambia, you could see they came in, they were supposed to be funding this Kafua Gorge project that I was looking at more than 11 years ago. And they pulled, they were like, no, that doesn't look like a good deal. We're not going to go there. So China Development Bank has been much more hesitant in lending in a place like Zambia. So there's, and they don't have the same kind of responsibility. The Exim Bank is the export credit agency. That's their whole job. And so they have a high requirement. Yeah, it's got to be pretty much 85% Chinese content. Actually, let me walk that statistic back. They don't have a particular, a project has to be like 85% because they only lend for 85% of it. So it's kind of 100% almost Chinese content. China Development Bank has been making loans to non-Chinese actors. They've been making loans to non-Chinese companies. They would prefer things to be Chinese content because that helps the home team, but they don't require it. So they're really different. I'll stop there.
I'll segue from what Deborah was saying on that. I used to do a lot of work with sitting next to China Development Bank and a little bit with China Exim. I should say everything I say today is based on public information, and that was years ago. But just on Zambia, for instance, to answer Ying's question, or not to answer it, but to respond to it, the implied interest rate based on my back of the envelope calculations for China Exim was about 3%, 3.3 implied interest rate, and the implied interest rate around 5.5, 6% for China Development Bank or some of the other banks. And the bonds are on face value close to 8% and now trading at probably about 18% because they're deeply discounted. But I think that the question you've asked two questions about double standard and also about really the chances for regional cooperation, I think, was what the question boils down to. And I think those are very profound questions about China and Africa. In terms of double standards, we could talk a lot about America, and I'm not just talking about today, but America's development, economic development, trade policies, tariff and subsidy policies. China is not acting in a malign way if you compare it to Europe and America at other stages of development. And I think that's not a very fruitful conversation to have. However, China acted in an incredibly thoughtful and prudent way, all in, during the last 30 years of its own development. And what I was alluding to before was China was very careful that foreign investors into China invested. When you build an airport in Zambia, you haven't invested in Zambia. You've sold the concrete to Zambia for the airport. You haven't invested unless you make an equity investment and stay for the long run. China insisted that foreign involvement in China had an equity investment that meant you were in for the future of the country. And it wasn't easy to get the equity out. it also insisted that foreign project developers had a commercial stake, a commercial risk in what they were doing. And again, if you get a contract to build a railroad and you're not part of the railroad after it's built, you don't have a commercial risk. You're not taking commercial risks. You don't have to analyze the project as carefully. So I do think that if China and Africa, if China could help Africa, and we're saying Africa, which of course is the wrong way to speak about all these very different countries, but if China could help different countries in Africa to learn from China's own experience, and if China was willing to allow the African countries to use some of the same conditions that China insisted on for its own sovereignty and its own self-respect when it was on the other side of the equation, I actually think in the medium and long run, it would help China enormously in its relations in those countries. And of course, it's not part of this discussion, but China's the perception of China in many of these countries is sometimes a problem. The second thing is also, I think, very important. In China for 30 years, if a foreign company was competing for a deal, as Professor Browdigan said, in Sichuan province and also in Tianjin, there was a way that China knew that was happening. They would share information, they would coordinate. The State Planning Commission would negotiate. The problem in so many African countries in East Africa, as she just mentioned, is they're competing with each other and not sharing information. And if the African regional groups could share some of the information and also set some standards for how they would go together and keep an eye on each other this way, I think it would in some ways capture the best of what China was able to do when it developed. And also it would level the playing field a little bit in the negotiations. And it's really an opportunity for let's say the East African community and some of these other groupings to find something that they could do together where they have a common interest in some of these outcomes. So I think your question goes to that. And I think we're going to see this in the future. There's an enormous opportunity for it. It's just waiting to happen. There's such an advantage for them for that to happen.
Thank you. I think that what Stephen just said answers one of the other questions that was posed and I didn't have a chance to articulate, and that has to do with the broader strategies by China as well as African countries in terms of how to make the best use of debt and loans. I see that Professor Gu is back. Ying, do you want to ask your question and have Professor Gu has the last word for this panel?
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, Professor Gu. So I wonder if you could quickly elaborate on your point about China's current efforts to sort of formulate its own approach to the soft law instruments in governing debt sustainability. Particularly, you said that China has a more sort of preference for long-term perspective so as to foster productive investment, in your own words. And I wonder, in terms of particular standards or criteria China has used for evaluating debt sustainability or credibility of an African country, what are those standards and how they are different from the current international standards used by multilateral agencies? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. So I think it's not only about law, maybe it's also related to the Chinese culture and Oriental culture, the flexibility things. So against this background, I also see a related question here, talking about asking about the best lending practice that may be different from the Western style. In terms of my observation over the China proposed analytical framework on debt sustainability under the Belt and Road Initiative, I see it's basically based upon the IMF and the World Bank Debt Analytical Framework, DSF. And in combination, it adds some new elements like this kind of flexibility. It will be more tolerant towards a higher debt to GDP ratio, I think, than the Western standards. it's basically the framework is basically kind of gives a kind of a discretion to the Chinese banks and the businesses who are doing business along the Belt and Road Initiative countries, and they have the discretion, a big discretion in actually apply it. So this is a kind of a international best practice. I guess, if in a nutshell, it will be being kind of flexible, general. That's maybe quite a different, or maybe even sounds weird in the eyes of the Western experts. So here I see the need for kind of mutual interaction between the Western practice and the Chinese own experience. It's decades of investments in Africa and other countries. So I guess this process, this campaign by the Chinese side is only beginning, and they still has a lot to learn how to get it more detailed, more able to be implemented. So let's wait and see. And I know it's a major job of the Chinese Ministry of Finance. So that's my general comment.
Okay, great. I think that brings us up right on time, 11 a.m. here in Hong Kong. Am I right that this is the conclusion of today's event, Ying?
Well, I think Maria also has some questions. I guess we can sort of continue this discussion. Well, and others who have other plans can log out now, but we can continue this discussion if there are people interested in.
Okay, so
yes.
Professor Clark, do you want to? Yes, please go ahead.
Sure, thanks very much. And yeah, folks might want to sign off, but I'm very happy to ask a question quickly of Deborah. As a political scientist, someone who is also focused on Southern Africa, I'm really interested to hear you talk a little bit more about the very particular relationship with Angola. I mean, as you talked about, Chinese investment in Angola is very unique. China's invested a lot since the end of the Civil War in 2002. But I don't understand what it is about Angola. I mean, apart from oil investment, but that's, you know, that's similar in other countries. What is it about Angola? How would you explain to us the very particular kind of relationship that's emerged and the particular patterns of investment that seem very unique to Angola? I mean, as you talked about in your presentation earlier, Angola really is an outlier. So can you tell us just a little bit more about the politics of that relationship and the history of it?
Well, I'm going to make it very easy and simple, but Maria, I think it is the oil. It's I think that explains most of that relationship. It's and if you look historically, you know, Angola was coming out of 40, 50 years of war when the Chinese first started getting quite active there. And they did not have a warm relationship historically with the MPLA. It's, you know, they were supportive of the Cold War thing. They were on the other side against the Russians, so they were more supporting UNITA. So they didn't have a long history, but it was a business opportunity. It was that ability to use the oil secured lending, which had been going on in Angola, Western banks for, I was just talking to somebody about this, a guy who had been working with a Western bank in Angola back, you know, before the Chinese got there. And he was telling me about how he used to head out to Angola to certify these oil exports for the repayment of the loans. But so it was an opportunity to take advantage of those oil exports that China needed and was going to be consuming, and then to make it work double, which is to pay for all those Chinese companies to do all of that work. And then Angola, at the end of the day, got all that infrastructure, which they paid for with the loans. So that was and it just went up to $46 billion worth. So that's why it's unusual, but it's not, and they're also the biggest oil supplier from Africa. So Venezuela is quite similar. So it's different political economies, but a similar relationship structurally, and also very worse. I mean, much worse. It's terrible, Venezuela. I shouldn't laugh.
Can I ask a quick question of Professor Gu? Is that, Professor Gu, if I could ask you a quick question, I'd be very interested in your views. You mentioned the Paris Club, and people are beginning to talk about whether China should join the Paris Club or not. I wondered if you expected that to happen, or if you thought there might be some obstacles to that on the Chinese side.
I think the time is getting mature for the China to join to consider joining the Paris Club. Broadly speaking, China these days getting more active in joining those multilateral institutions. And as you know, China holds the banner of multilateralism very high, and so that's a general background. But in terms of this specific Paris Club issue, actually China has been negotiating, has close connection with the Paris Club, although it's not a formal member of it. I have some historical statistics. China, through this kind of bilateral negotiation with or talk with the United States, with France, UK, all major Paris Club members, and China's strongly expressed interest in joining it, and those counterparts in Paris Club also expressed their wish or hope for China to join it. I do not have very inside information, but I observe that maybe in terms of the debt cancellation, the transparency issues, the statistics, China has some obstacles to join it. But as during this pandemic, China for the first time joined the G20 debt suspension initiative, and later the common framework. And actually the Minister of the Finance of China said this is the first time for China to participate in this kind of initiatives. And these initiatives actually has close collaboration with the Paris Club. So I think there is a gradual step for China to get in there. And I think through this kind of research or our discussion in economy, in academia and beyond, and this the day for China to join it will come. Yeah.
Very good. I think I'm the person to close that has to announce the closing of this panel. And I'd like to thank everybody and all the audience who have hung around, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow, right? Ying, you want to have an announcement for tomorrow?
Yes, thank you, Professor Lee. I want to again express my gratitude to all the participants here today, for the panelists, the moderator, and the audience for this wonderful session. Tomorrow we will start at 9:30, and the topic for tomorrow's discussion is transparent governance. I think it's a good way to continue our discussion, as we've laid out a lot of questions in this debt sustainability, which has to do with the lack of transparency during the negotiation stage. So it's, stay tuned, and we will be back tomorrow. Thank you.
All right. See you guys.
Thank you for
Bye-bye.
doing
Thank
it.
you,
guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so
Nice
much.
to see everybody. Okay.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.